Hello, assalamu alaikum. So welcome back to this week's another video. Previously we discussed about need finding problems, which is one of the earlier stages in design life cycle. Now we'll move towards another design life cycle part, which is design alternatives. So we will be discussing for design alternatives in this week's video lecture. So when we have developed a good understanding of the needs of our user, it's time to move on to the second phase of the design life cycle, which is design alternatives. This is when we start to brainstorm how to accomplish the task we have been investigating. The problem here is that design is very hard. It's hard for a number of reasons. The number of choices we have to make and things we have to control is more expensive than ever before. Are we designing for desktops, laptops, tablets, smartphones, smartwatches, augmented reality, virtual reality, 2D, 3D, gesture input, pen input, keyboard input, mouse input, or voice input? In this video, we are going to talk about how to generate ideas for these type of designs. Now let's talk about some mistakes which are usual when which are very common in users or very common in developers actually. So the biggest mistake that a designer can make is jumping straight to designing an interface without understanding the users or understanding the task. The second biggest mistake though is settling on a single design idea or a single genre of design ideas too early. This can take on multiple forms. One form is staying too allegiant to existing designs or products. Take the example of this thermostat. If you settled on tweaking the existing design of a thermostat, you would never invent the one on the right side, which is the one shown on the right side, which is the nest. So if you are working on improving an existing interface, try to actually distance yourself from the existing solutions, at least initially during the brainstorming session. But this is also a problem if you are designing interfaces for new tasks as well. Imagine, for instance, that while you were observing people exercising, you started sketching interface ideas like how to make the buttons big enough or what buttons need to be featured prominently. In doing so, you are getting tunnel vision and missing out on any design alternatives that might involve voice or gesture control. So the second biggest mistake you can make is focusing too strongly on one alternative from the very beginning, instead of exploring the entire range of possible design alternatives. The reason why this is such a common mistake is that there's natural tendency to think of it as a waste of time to develop interfaces you are not going to end up using. You think you can get it done faster just by picking one early on and sticking to it. But fleshing out ideas for interfaces you don't end up using isn't a waste of time, because by doing so you continue to learn more about the problem. The experience of exploring those ideas that you leave behind will make you a better designer for the ideas that you do choose to pursue. In all likelihood, your ultimate design will be some combination of the design alternatives that you explored earlier. So take the security system example from my earlier videos. There are two ways of interacting with it: the keypad and the keychain. Two different designs that, in this particular instance, integrated just fine. Different alternatives won't always integrate side by side this easily. But the design process as a whole is an iterative process of brainstorming, combining, abandoning, revising, and improving your ideas. And that requires you to start with several ideas in the first place. Now the design space, on the other hand, is the area in which we design our solutions to this problem. When we talk about the problem we are solving here, we define the problem space as disabling a security system as we enter a home. We define our problem as far as possible away from the current interfaces for doing it. Our goal during the design alternative phase is to explore the possible design space. The current design space for this problem was small wall-mounted devices and portable devices like my keychain. But as we design, the space of possible ideas might expand. For example, as we go along, we might be interested in voice interfaces or interfaces with our mobile phones or wearable devices. We don't want to narrow down too early by sticking devices on walls or devices on keychains. We want to brainstorm lots of possible approaches and grow a large space of possible designs. Now, when you first start brainstorming, your goal is to generate a lot of ideas. These ideas can be very short, very high level, and very general. Your goal is just to generate an expanse of them. They don't even have to be ideas for interfaces, just any idea for solving the problem will do the job. If you look online, you will find lots of great guides to how to brainstorm ideas. One of the most interesting takeaways is that research generally indicates better to start with individual brainstorming. That's not intuitive though. We often hold meetings for brainstorming, but it should start out individually. That's because brainstorming is most effective when it initially generates a lot of ideas. But groups tend to coalesce around ideas pretty early. Now, brainstorming individual before brainstorming as a group is a good idea to start. So start out individually, generate a lot of ideas. Each idea needs to only be a few words or of a sentence. Don't worry right now if they are good or bad. Write down everything. Think about how you design with different types of interactions, like gestures and voice and touch. Think about how you design for different interfaces like smartwatches or tablets or augmented reality. Think about how you design for different audiences, novices and experts, or kids and adults. Get silly with it. Some of the best ideas start as silly as they get. How would you design this for your dog or for your cat? How would you design this for someone with 3 arms or 3 legs? Go nuts. Your goal is to generate a lot of ideas. These are going to get loaded in your mind and they'll crop up in interesting ways throughout the rest of the design process. That's why it's important to generate a lot of ideas. You never know when they'll come up. Now look at this example. So see, as you might be able to get it gets kind of crazy. It's all over the place. You can kind of trace through this entire reasoning process on here. So some of the ideas are somewhat straightforward. Maybe you got voice commands, maybe you got gestures, you got voice transcription. You tried to separate it out into feedback methods and also the way the user actually interacts, because we could kind of combine those. Some of these are actually pretty crazy. He has got on skin interface, he have mentioned it, and he have seen some prototypes for things that would let you actually just press on your skin to do different kinds of interactions. He has also got augmented reality like Google Glass. He has also mentioned a portable keyboard like Twiddler. So notice that this is kind of a mess, but that's a good thing. Lists are fine, but chances are a lot of your ideas are related to each other. Notice also that he never crumpled up his piece of paper. He never threw it away. He crossed one thing out. That's because he wrote the wrong word. Really, at this stage, you don't want to reject any ideas. Your goal is to kind of free-form brainstorm and got all your thoughts out here. So here are some quick 5 tips for effective individual brainstorming. Number 1. Write down the core problem. Keep this visible. You want to let your mind enter a divergent thinking mode, but you also want to remain grounded in the problem. Writing down the problem and keeping it available will help you remain focused while remaining creative. Number 2. Constrain yourself. Decide you want at least one idea in a number of different categories. Personally, I try to make sure I have at least 3 ideas that use non-traditional interaction methods, like touch and voice. You can constrain yourself in strange ways too. Force yourself to think of solutions that are too expensive or not physically possible. The act of thinking in these directions will help you out later. Number 3. Aim for 20. Don't stop until you have 20 ideas. These ideas don't have to be very well formed or complex. They can be simply one-sentence descriptions of designs you might pursue. This forces you to think through the problem, rather than getting tunnel vision on an early idea. Number 4. Take a break. You don't need to come up with all of these at once, and in fact, you will probably find it's easier if you leave and come back. I'm not just talking about a 10-minute break either. Stop brainstorming and decide to continue a couple days later, but be ready to write down new ideas that come to you. Number 5. Divide and conquer. If you are dealing with a problem like helping kids lead healthier lifestyles, divide it into smaller problems and brainstorm solutions to those. If we are designing audiobooks for exercises, for example, we might divide it into things like the ability to take and review notes or the ability to control playback hands-free. Divide it like that and brainstorm solutions to each individual little problem. Now, group brainstorming presents some significant issues. Thompson in 2008 laid out 4 behaviors in group brainstorming that can block progress. The first is social loafing. People often don't tend to work as hard in groups as they would individually. It's easy to feel like the responsibility for unproductive brainstorming is shared and deflected. In individual brainstorming, it's clearly on the individual. The second blocker is conformity. People in groups tend to want to agree. Studies have shown that group brainstorming leads to convergent thinking. The conversation the group has tends to force participants down the same line of thinking, generating fewer and less varied ideas than the individuals acting alone. During brainstorming though, the goal is divergent thinking, lots of ideas, lots of creativity. The third blocker is production blocking. In group brainstorming, there are often individuals who dominate the conversation and make it difficult for others to actually be heard. Their ideas can thus command more weight, not because of the strength of the ideas, but because of the volume of the description. The fourth blocker is performance matching. People tend to converge in terms of passion and performance, which can lead to a loss of momentum over time. That might be able to get people excited if they are around other excited people initially. But more often than not, it saps the energy of those who enter with enthusiasm. In addition to these 4 challenges, I would add a fifth. Group brainstorming may also be prone to power dynamics or biases. No matter how supportive and collaborative a boss might be, there likely always exists a tacit pressure to build on her suggestions, which dampens creative brainstorming. There also exists considerable literature stating that other biases based on gender, age, race complain to these group sessions as well. Now note that this doesn't mean group brainstorming should be avoided altogether. What it means is that we should enter into group brainstorming with strong ideas of how to address these issues, ideally after a phase of individual brainstorming has already occurred. Now, to have an effective group brainstorming session, we need to have some rules to govern the individual's behavior to address those common challenges. In 1957, Osborne outlined 4 such rules. Number 1. Expressiveness. Any idea that comes to mind, share it out loud, no matter how strange. Number 2. Non-evaluation. No criticizing ideas, no evaluating the ideas themselves yet. Number 3. Quantity. Brainstorming as many as possible. The more you have, the greater your idea of finding a novel idea. Number 4. Building. While you shouldn't criticize others' ideas, you should absolutely try to build on them. Then in 1996, Oxley, Zimdolet and Paulus presented 4 additional rules. Number 1. Stay focused. Keep the goal in mind at all times. Number 2. No explaining ideas. Say the idea and move on. No justifying ideas. Number 3. When you hit a roadblock, revisit the problem. Say it again out loud. Number 4. Encourage others. If someone isn't speaking up, encourage them to do so. Note that all 8 of these rules prescribe what individuals should do, but they are only effective if every individual does them. So it's good to cover these rules, post them publicly, and call one another on breaking from them. Now the rules given by Osborne, Oxley, Zimdolet and Paulus are about helping individuals understand how they should act in group brainstorming. Here are a few additional tips though that apply less to the individual participants and more to the design of the activity as a whole. Number 1. Go through every individual idea. Have participants perform individual brainstorming ahead of time and bring ideas to the group brainstorming session, and explicitly make sure to go through each one. That will help avoiding converging around an idea too early and make sure everyone is heard. Number 2. Find the optimal size. Social loafing occurs when there is a lack of individual responsibility. When you have so many people that not everyone will get to talk anyway, it's easy for disengagement to occur. I would say group brainstorming session should generally not involve more than 5 people. If more people need to give perspectives than that, then you can have intermediate groups that then send ideas along to a later group. Number 3. Set clear rules for communication. Get a 20-second timer, and when someone starts talking, start it. Once the timer is up, someone else gets to speak. The goal is to ensure that no one can block others' ideas by talking too much, whether intentionally or accidentally. Number 4. Set clear expectations. Enthusiasm starts to wane when people are unsure how long a session will go or what will mark its end. You might set the session to go a certain amount of time or dictate that a certain number of ideas must get generated. No matter how you do it, make sure that people participating can assess where in the brainstorming session they are. Number 5. End with ideas, not decisions. It's tempting to want to leave a brainstorming session with a single idea on which to move forward, but that's not the goal. Your brainstorming session should end with several ideas. Then let them percolate in everyone's mind before coming back and choosing the ideas to pursue later. Now the brainstorming process should lead you to a list of bunch of high-level general design alternatives. These are likely just a few words or a sentence each, but they describe some very general idea of how you might design the interface to accomplish this task. Your next step is to try to flesh these ideas out into 3 or 4 ideas that are worth taking forward to the prototyping stage. Some of the ideas you might be able to dismiss pretty quickly, that's alright. You can generate good ideas without generating a lot of ideas, even though you won't end up using all of them. In other places, you might explore an idea a little before dismissing it, or you might combine 2 ideas into a new idea. In the rest of this video lecture, I'll give you some thought experiments you can use to evaluate these ideas and decide what to keep, what to combine, and what to dismiss. The first common method we can use to flesh out design alternative is called personas. With personas, we create actual characters to represent our users. So let's create a persona for the problem of helping exercisers take notes while reading books. We'll start by giving her a name and a face, and then we'll fill out some details. We want to understand who this persona is. We want to be able to mentally simulate her. We want to be able to say, what would Annika do in this situation? What is she thinking when she's about to go exercise? What kind of things might interrupt her? What might want to put in some more domain specific information as well? Like, why does this person exercise? When do they exercise? What kind of books do they like? How are they feeling when they are exercising? Where do they actually exercise? We want to create at least 3 or 4 of these different personas, and perhaps more depending on how many different stakeholders we have for our problem. The important thing is that these should be pretty different people, representing different elements of our design, different elements of our task, so we can explore its entire range. We don't want to design just for Anika, but we want to design for real people. And so we should define personas that represent the range of real people that we care about. That way we can ask our questions like, how would Janet feel about this design alternative? How would Paul feel about this design alternative? Using this, we can start to extort the space and find the options that has the most appeal. Now, personas are meant to give us a small number of characters that we can reason about empathetically. However, it can sometimes also be useful to formulaically generate a large number of user profiles to explore the full design space. We can do this by defining a number of different variables about how our users and the possibilities within each. So here are a few examples. We can ask ourselves, do we care about novice users or expert users or both? Do we care about users that read casually, that read seriously, or both kinds of users? Do we only want to cater to users that are highly motivated to use our app, which can make things a little bit easier on us? Or do we want to assume that it won't take much to stop them from using our app? Can we assume a pretty high level of technological literacy, or are we trying to cater to more casual users as well? And are we interested in users that are going to use our app all the time, or in users who are going to use our app only occasionally, or both? All of these directions present some interesting design considerations that we need to keep in mind. For example, for users that are going to use our tool very often, our major consideration is efficiency. We want to make sure they can do what they need to do as quickly as possible. And oftentimes, that might be relying on them to know more about how to use the app. But if we are designing for users that use our app pretty rarely, we need to make sure to keep all the interactions discoverable and visible. That way, every time they come back to the app, it's like the first time they came back to it. They don't need to remember anything from the previous time because we don't know how long it's been since the last time they have used it. If we want to design for both, then we have our work cut out for us. We need to either design very efficient interaction methods that nonetheless are discoverable and visible, or we need to design two sets of interaction methods. One way that's very discoverable and visible, and one way it's very efficient. We see this with our example of the hotkeys for copy and paste. If you don't know how to use them, you have a way of finding them. So it caters to either novice users or users who haven't used the program in a while. But because you can also do it with simple hotkeys, it caters to those users who use it more frequently and makes it more efficient for those who are going to be doing it a lot. In deciding what to design, we need to understand what groups, what profiles we are designing for, and use that to inform our design decisions. Inexperienced designers often make big mistakes here. They either try to design for everybody, which rarely works, or they design with no one in particular in mind. And so, certain areas of program are good for some users, others are good for other type of users. An entire program as a whole is not good for any particular type of user. So it's very important that we understand the range of users that we are designing for, and that we make sure the range is actually something that we feasibly can design for. Now, building on the idea of a persona, we can take that person and stretch her out over time and see what is she thinking. What is she doing at various stages of interacting with her interface or interacting with the task at hand. I have also heard this called journey maps, although journey maps usually cover much longer periods of time. They cover the entire expanse of the person's life, why they are interested in something and where they are going from here. Timelines can be more narrowed to the specific time which users are interacting with the task or with the program. So our goal is to take the persona and stretch it out over time. So for our example, what sparks Annika to decide to exercise in the first place? That might be really useful information to know. After she decided to exercise, what did she do next? In theory, she doesn't just start right there. She goes exercise somewhere. She has kind of setup process. Then what does she do? In this case, maybe she setups her audiobooks as she actually pushes play, puts her headphones in, and so on. And then there's probably a period of actual exercise in her example. And then at the end, she turns off the audiobook. The usefulness of drawing this as a timeline is it starts to let us ask some pretty interesting questions. What prompts this person to actually engage in the task in the first place? What actions lead up to the task? How are they feeling at every stage of the task? And can we use that? How would each design alternative impact their experience throughout this process? For example, if our persona for Annika was that she really doesn't like to exercise but she knows she really needs to, then we know her mood during this phase might be kind of a glum. We need to design our app with the understanding that she might have kind of low motivation to engage in this at all. If our app is a little bit frustrating to use, then it might turn her off of exercising altogether. On the other hand, if Annika really likes to exercise, then maybe she is in a very good mood during this phase. And if she likes exercising on its own, maybe she forgets to even set up the audiobook at all. So then we need to design our app with that in mind. We need to design it such that there's something built into it that could maybe remind her that when she gets to a certain location, she meant to start her audiobook. So stretching this out as a timeline lets us explore not only who the user is, but also what they are thinking and what they are feeling. And how what we design can integrate with the task that they are participating in. Exploring our different design alternatives in this way allows us to start to gauge which designs might have the greatest potential to positively impact the user's experience. And they also let us explore what might be different between different users. Our design might need to be different for Annika, who loves to exercise, and Paul, who hates exercising. This timeline lets us start to explore those more personal elements. Now we can create general timelines for routine interactions with our design alternatives, but it's often even more interesting to examine the specific scenarios users will encounter while using our interfaces. Rather than outlining the whole course of interaction, scenarios let us discuss specific kinds of interactions and events that we want to be able to handle. This is sometimes also referred to as storyboards, sequences of diagrams or drawings to outline what happens in a particular scenario. The difference between timelines and in storyboards and scenarios is that timelines, in my experience at least, tend to be pretty general. They are how a routine interaction with the interface or routine interaction with the design alternative goes. Scenarios and storyboards are more specific. They are about a particular person interacting in a particular way with particular events coming up. So let's build one of these scenarios. Let's say the user is Morgan and she is out jogging when a fire engine goes by. And if you have any idea about fire engine, it's like a huge sound and you cannot listen to your surroundings. Even you cannot listen what is being played on your mobile phone, even with your headphones on. So it's so loud that she misses about 30 seconds of the book. How did she recover from this? What we want to go through that question with each of our different design alternatives. For our touch interface, she would need to stop, pull out her phone, turn on the screen, and pause the book. For her voice interface, she would have to wait for the fire engine to finish passing and then say rewind. Because chances are, if it's too loud for her to hear her book, it's probably too loud for her phone to hear her voice command. But for a gestural interface, she could simply make the gesture that will allow her to pause the book, and then play again when the fire engine has finished passing. Ideally, we'd like to outline several such scenarios and explore them for various personas and design alternatives. Of course, now we are reaching 3 degrees of freedom, so it's not crucial that we explore every possible combination of persona, scenario, and design alternative. This is a more fluid process of exploring what ideas have potential and what ideas are worth exploring further. We might find there are certain combination of scenarios and personas that we really care about, and that completely rule out certain design alternatives. If we really care about allowing her to exercise in a loud area, that goes ahead and tells us that a voice interface might not be the direction that we want to go in. Or for another example, if our earlier need-finding exercises reveal a significant number of exercisers carry weights or other things in their hands, then gestural interfaces start to look a lot less promising. Now, as video technology has gotten more and more ubiquitous, storyboards have also taken on a different form in a lot of prototypes that I have seen. There's been an emergence of what is called video prototyping, which is basically doing a video mock-up of what someone would actually look like interacting with a certain interface to show to people so that they can see whether or not that would actually be something that would help them in their everyday life. So storyboards taken into an extreme could actually be a video mock-up of what it would be like to use the finished product. Now, in our unit on principles, we talk about task analysis, including things like cognitive task analysis or human information processor models. Performing those analyses as part of our need finding also gives us a nice tool for exploring our design alternatives. Using this, we can start to look at how exactly the goals, operators, methods, and selection rules of the GOMS model map up to the ideas of our design alternatives. How does the user achieve each of their goals in each interface? How relatively easy are the goals to achieve between the different design alternatives? With the results of our cognitive task analysis, we can start to ask some deeper questions about what the user is keeping in mind as well. Given what we know about things competing for our user's attention, what are the likelihoods that each interface will work? In some ways, this is a similar process to using personas we outlined earlier, but with a subtle difference. Personas are personal and meant to give us an empathetic view of the user's experience. User models are more objective and meant to give us a measurable and comparable view of the user experience. So ideally, the result of this kind of analysis is we would be able to say that the different alternatives have these different phases, and these different phases have different efficiencies or different speeds associated with them. So we could start to say exactly how efficient one design is compared to another. Now, design alternatives are not with their respective pros and cons. So in this video, we have covered several different ways of developing design alternatives, and we'll go through each of their pros and cons separately with respect to the given advantages on the left hand side. So let's start to wrap up the lesson by exploring this with an exercise. Here are the methods that we have covered, and here are some other potential advantages. For each row, mark which of the different methods possesses that advantage. Note that these might be somewhat relative, so your answer might differ from mine, and that's perfectly fine. So for my answer, the scenarios are really the ones that include the entire task context. You can make the case that personas and timelines do as well, but I tend to think that these are a little bit too separated from the task to really include the context. Personas and user profiles, on the other hand, do include the user's context, They include plenty of information about who the user is, why they are doing this task, and what their motivations are. You could make the argument as well that scenarios and timelines include the user's contexts, because the way we describe them, they are instances of the personas being stretched out over a scenario or over time. User profile probably do the cleanest job of delineating the target audience. With our personas, we have kind of a fuzzy idea of who our different users or of who our different users are. But our user profiles really formally articulate the space of your users in which we are interested. As far as general workflows, that's what user modeling is really good at. It really outlines the phases or steps or operators that users use in a general sense. You could say the same thing about timelines to a certain extent, although timelines are more focused on what the user is thinking and feeling and less on their actual workflow with regard to the task. As far as capturing activity over time, scenarios, timelines, and user modeling all have an element of time in what they analyze. And possibly one of the bigger benefits of using scenarios is they allow us to capture potential edge cases more easily. Timelines, user models, user profiles, and personas are all about the general user or the general routine interaction with the task. But scenarios let us pose interesting and novel situations so that we can kind of mentally simulate how our different design alternatives will work with that scenario. For example, we wouldn't say that a fire engine going by the user which is listening to an audiobook is a routine thing. So it probably wouldn't come up in our timeline or in our user modeling. But we can develop a scenario that explores how is she going to deal with that particular event. And while it might seem a little silly to focus so much on edge cases, as we do more and more design, we start to discover that there are a lot of edge cases. They are all different. But a lot of our time is spent dealing with those unique circumstances that fall pretty far outside the routine interaction with the program. Now, if you have already chosen to focus on a certain area of technology like wearable devices or gestural interaction, then in some ways you have put the cart before the horse. You have chosen your design before exploring the problem. As a learning experience though, that's perfectly fine. It's fine to say, I want to explore augmented reality and I'm going to find a task that lets me do it. You are still exploring whether or not augmented reality is the right solution for that task. You are just altering the task if not, instead of altering the design if not. For other domains, you might need to make sure to create personas for different stakeholders in healthcare, for instance. You would want to make sure any interface you design takes into consideration nurses, doctors, patients, managers, family members, and more. So do you want to create personas for all those different types of people as well and make sure to explore scenarios that affect each stakeholder? Now the goal of the design alternative stage of the design lifecycle is to generate lots of ideas and then synthesize those ideas into a handful worth exploring further. So we started with some heuristic for generating lots and lots of ideas through both individual and group brainstorming. Then we proposed some methods for exploring those ideas and deciding which ones to pursue. Now these were all thought experiments. We haven't actually gotten to the point of designing any of these interfaces yet. That would be the next stage. At the end of the design alternative stage, we want to select a handful of designs that are worth carrying forward and prototyping to then give to users for actual feedback. Now hopefully as the next week is the last week of the semester, I would try to upload my lectures on prototyping as well. But till then, if you have any questions regarding the design alternatives, please feel free to comment, or you can just upload your questions on Google Classroom, or you can ask me directly in our live sessions. So till the next video of prototyping, goodbye and stay safe.